As training camp approaches, we'll be reviewing several players' performances and the 2023 season and discussing how they could impact the Eagles during the 2024 season. Today, we'll be discussing Bryce Huff. Today, we're going to be talking about Bryce Huff, new addition to the Philadelphia Eagles edge rush group. Huff comes over with a lot of fanfare, and he's definitely one of my favorite additions to the team this offseason. And let's just take a look at his overall game and some of the numbers to describe who he is as a person. Huff has been one of the most efficient pass rushers, especially from the edge over the past two seasons. And last season, he ranked second in pressure rate out of the top 150 edge rushers. He was fourth in pass rush win rate. His real pressure rate, which is his total pressures, subtracting out his unblocked pressures and cleanup pressures, was sixth out of 150. And the pass rush score that I used was third out of 150. Now, this isn't just a one-year wonder. He did have somewhat of a breakout this past season because he took on more snaps, but he was still very efficient even in the year prior. Over the past two seasons, he was first in pressure rate, second in pass rush win rate, second in real pressure rate, and second in pass rush score. So he has been extremely efficient over his limited snap shares. Now, when you look at him on film, he has a pretty polished pass rush game plan in terms of the moves he uses, the counters he uses, how he pairs all of that up with what his strengths are as a player. He loves to use a bunch of cross chops and swipes. He's very good at dipping his shoulder and using ghost techniques. And just due to his stature and the way that he's built, he's able to corner at the top of the rush very easily. He carries a lot of momentum when he's at the top of the rush and needing to flatten to get to the quarterback. And that showed off with the number of quarterback hits he had, even in a limited playing time. So I think that Huff is, if you give him more snaps, I do think he's a player that can carry over that efficiency. I do think that efficiency will go down some, just naturally. So if you look at what he did for the Jets, he played he was their primary third down pass rusher along with Jermaine Johnson. And if you look at third down pass snaps, league-wide, when players know that it's a pass, they generally win at a higher rate. So they have higher pressure scores, higher pass rush win scores. So assuming that he's going to be playing more first and second down snaps, naturally that some of his metrics are going to come down. But even when you look at the best pass rushers on third down, they often end up being the best pass rushers on first and second down too. So I think that this can carry over. But before I go any further about Huff, Eric, what are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I mean, right away, people, when they signed him, asked, is he going to play all three downs? And I think the contract says it all. You don't pay a guy that much money if he's going to be relegated to a situational pass rusher. And the Jets, they had a lot of guys in the queue behind him, specifically Will McDonald, a first-round pick they invested in, who was only able to garner very few snaps in pass rush situations last year. And so they didn't want to pay him. That also did make it a little bit odd that they went and got Reddick. So we'll see how that materializes. In terms of Huff, I'm not that concerned about his run defense for a couple reasons. Number one, the Jets coaching staff came out and said that for the position he played, he actually was amongst their best run defenders. It was simply because they could get more juice out of him in pass rush situations, and they had other competent players to play rundowns that they staggered the snaps that way. He also played inside backer in college. There's reps on tape where he shows good block shedding and he knows how to wrap up. So I think he's better than perception. In terms of the pass rush, I've mentioned before that he's measured as the second fastest get off in NFL history. So he times the snap well and has an extreme burst in his first two steps. He's definitely not what I would consider a long defensive end in terms of his wingspan, but he actually uses that to his advantage because when he goes against these tackles who are like 6'7", they can't really get his hands on him because he plays with such a low pad level, and that just has got to be a nightmare to try to block him. And over time, he's become more and more polished as a pass rusher. Nick has a video that highlights a variety of his pass rush repertoire, including cross chops, inside counters, swim moves, along with other moves. The thing is, I did think he benefited from, number one, he was very fresh coming in on obvious passing downs, and he went against what I would call a mediocre set of right tackles. Now, yes, he did play, I want to say maybe a third of his snaps on the other side. But if you just look at all the tackles he got a sack against, I wouldn't say it was an elite group by any means. And specifically looking towards next season, the Eagles are going to face several really good right tackles, which could mitigate some of his production. But of course, he'll have more snaps. So I'm kind of in agreement with you, Nick, that I think the efficiency will drop, not precipitously, but marginally, but the volume will increase a lot. Ultimately, if you want to put a number on it, I think he'll finish somewhere around 12 to 13 sacks with quite a few hurries and quarterback hits in there. And given how much younger he is and has improved every year, I thought going this direction was a smart move.
Going this direction over re-signing Reddick. Yeah, I agree on that front. Now, that's a whole nother discussion that I realistically could take, that could be a whole episode on its own, just discussing the nuances of the contract situation and just essentially swapping out Huff for Reddick. Now, in terms of his run defense, like you said, I think some of his issues are overstated. Don't get me wrong, when his first couple years in the league, his run defense was really bad. It was not good at all. And if you look at his PFF run defense score, it's not very good from this past year either. I think it's like a 48, which is horrible. But when you go through and actually look at some of the games, like there was it seems like a lot of the score was because he gave up a couple big plays that really counted against the team. Obviously, you don't want to see that. And on top of that, it's just that he didn't make a ton of plays in the run game to mitigate those negative scores. Listen, he's probably not going to become a run stopping savant. That's probably not what he's going to be. But you know what? Reddick wasn't either. He wasn't really brought here to be a top run stopper. But what he can do, he holds his own against tackles. He does create some knockback and some penetration and can control tight ends. And a lot of his issues earlier in his career, I could boil it down to a little bit of play strength, which I think he's improved, and a lot of bad technique, which you can see him getting better at on film. Hopefully he continues to take that next step so that his run defense can be on par with where he is as a pass rusher, because that would just be a dynamite signing for the Eagles at that point in time. But I don't think we're ever going to see this guy as a phenomenal run stopper. Now, on to the next point of what you brought up. In terms of him not going against the best group of tackles, I'd agree, but he did go against several really good tackles. And I mean, for instance, he got a sack against Rashawn Slater, which he's a former All-Pro. He only gave up 3 sacks last year. He is one of the best players in the game. And if you look at the top edge rushers in the league, they get most of their sacks against worse off players. They're not usually getting their sacks against the Trent Williams and the Tyron Smiths and the Tristan Wirfs of the world. It happens for sure, but not to a huge degree. Most of those sacks do come against your lesser players. What I did think was interesting so I've talked about this before. If you know who Brandon Thorne is, he's a great person to follow on Twitter, or pretty much follow his Substack. A lot of great information about offensive line play. He partners with Duke Manyweather, who trains Lane Johnson in the offseason. So this guy has some real clout. He knows what he's talking about. He gives out pressure scores and sack scores every year, where essentially he's going through and grading the top 50 or so players each year in terms of, okay, was this a pressure that this person just kind of fell into, or did they win with a move? Did they win based on their own merit? And then he also is factoring in, how often are you beating high-end talent? and what he calls those rare high quality pressures. He had one rare high quality sack this past season, but if you look at the top edge rushers, half of them don't even have didn't have a single one last year. And the guys that did have some really only had 2 or 3 at most, and that's again on higher snap shares. When you look at the pressure rates, he had 3 rare high quality pressures. Again, there was like Aiden Hutchinson off the top of my head had 0 last year, and we consider him a top pass rusher. TJ Watt had 0. Hassan Reddick has never had a rare high quality sack or pressure. These top end guys just don't give up a lot of pressures, but Huff was able to get 4 pressures or sacks on his own last season. So I think that does say something about he's not just beating bad guys. Of course he does, but he has the skills to beat high level players as well. He had a couple pressures against Teron Armstead as well last season. But thinking about, can he actually keep this up, and is there precedent for him to increase his snap share? Because looking at how Fangio has typically used his best pass rushers in the past, they're getting usually somewhere around 800 snaps a season, or somewhere about 70 to 75 to 80% of the total snaps available for the edge rushers. Huff was around I wrote it down here somewhere. He's at like 485, something like that. He's probably going to see an increase of 3 to 350 snaps next season if he can prove to be good enough on rundowns. And I think he's going to end up playing. If you look at who's behind him on the depth chart, it's not like they have a ton of, run stoppers that you have to play. So I don't think there's anyone that's necessarily going to cut into his snaps because of his run defense or because someone else's run defense is superior. But if we look at, some previous history, a couple of good comparisons. Shaq Barrett, he played behind Von Miller and Bradley Chubb in Denver and didn't get a whole lot of playing time. He flashed in a couple of seasons, and then his snap share jumped significantly, and then he had his best seasons ever once he really started to play more snaps. I'll throw up all those numbers on the screen if you're watching on YouTube so you can see the difference in the snaps he was getting and then his pressure rates and his sack numbers. Another great example is Trey Hendrickson. He really flashed his last year in New Orleans, and then he goes to Cincinnati, and he's gotten way better the more that he's played. So those are there is precedent that this can happen where a guy like Huff in a limited timeshare has gotten more snaps and then have turned into really good players. And the thing about those two players, they weren't close to as efficient as what Huff has been at this point in Huff's career. So we could potentially at the high end be looking at a guy that could become a top 5 pass rusher in the NFL. So, it does make you a little excited. Now, on the flip side, I think a good example of a player that didn't necessarily, or someone that played lower snaps shares for much of their career, never really took that next step. For Eagles fans, Vinny Currier is a pretty similar example of that, where he was pretty efficient on the snaps that he got, but he pretty much remained a rotational pass rusher for his entire career. He had a season where he had 11 sacks. Bryce Huff just came off a season where he had 10 sacks, so there is some similarities there. Obviously, we hope Huff is at least somewhere in between what those guys are, and hopefully towards the top end. But I think there is precedent that Huff can end up becoming a top end pass rusher in the league with increased snaps. Now, Fangio is also going to drop his edge rushers into coverage. And Eric, you mentioned he did play linebacker in college. So did you have any thoughts on how you think he might transition into Fangio's defense?
Yeah, I think he'll be great in that role. Now, specifically, if you look at last year, there was roughly 50 times where Reddick dropped in the coverage. You can fact check me on that. And probably around 25 for Sweat. So it's not a trivial number. You're talking, 3 times per game on the high end. And I thought Reddick, the tools would suggest that he would be good in that role. He's probably the most athletic and nimble edge rusher there is in the NFL. But for whatever reason, his coverage instincts and awareness, reactions, positioning was horrible. I thought he was completely ineffective in that role. I can't recall. Maybe he had one pass breakup, but
yeah, he had a great one against the Texans in 2022, where it's like you see, like I think he had a pivot and open his hips back up the other way, and he made a diving swat, and it's like, wow, this isn't a weapon right here where he can be used in multiple ways. But yeah, maybe that's part of the reason he's not here anymore. Maybe he really didn't want to drop into coverage, and he's with the Jets. The Jets aren't going to drop him into coverage hardly ever. They just don't do that in the Saleh style defense. And for what it's worth, Huff did have the highest percentage of coverage drops for the Jets when they did drop players into coverage, at least in 2023. I didn't go back through the previous years. And he was kind of their designated quarterback spy player. So if they were playing a team like they had a mobile quarterback like the Ravens and or the Chiefs, he was a guy that would be spying the quarterback. So I think there is some precedent that he can become a solid enough and competent enough, in coverage. And also on top of that, hopefully with better coaching and more buy-in, that everyone that ends up dropping into coverage is a little better this year, because it really seemed like no one was good at it last year.
Yeah, and we'll get into that more in our long form pod. But yeah, I'm very optimistic about Huff in coverage because I watched some snaps of him at Memphis and he looked like competent in coverage. And it's not necessarily that his ball skills are like superior. In fact, you mentioned that play Reddick had. When he was in perfect position, it looked awesome. The problem is he was almost never in the right position. I think from that standpoint, I think Huff will have a big advantage. And the other thing is he'll be playing presumably on the strong side a lot more often. And from what I saw, if you're in the standard defensive fronts, the weak side guy often dropped in coverage more. And then when it was the strong side guy, they would actually line him up face up against the slot receiver. So you might see some looks where like Huff is way out wide and then kind of just like stays in a little like flat zone. So yeah, I'm overall, I'm not worried about it.
Yeah, and he'll definitely end up dropping in the flat and be lined up out wide. There's a number of plays that you see that come up on the Dolphins film. That's a discussion that we'll get more into on the long form podcast. But I think Huff's a player that we're both really excited about. I do think he's a player that should be able to carry over what he's doing to a bigger snap share. But there is always a risk. He may not, be as good. But again, if he does have a drop off in his efficiency, does he go from first to 20th with the contract he's getting paid? Is that doesn't kill you as much as if you were paying this guy like a top 10 pass rusher in the league. Now, obviously, you still want that, that guy that can really close the game for you, like Reddick did. But I mean, if you look at where Reddick was this past season, his numbers were way, way below, especially in an efficiency standing, way below where Huff's was. So I think I'm with you. I think you mentioned 12. What was your sack total? 12 to 13 is what you think? Yeah, I'm around there. I think he'll probably end up about 12. I think high end, maybe 16-ish, like we saw Reddick do his first year with the Eagles. I think you do need a little bit more help from your back end, because we did see a big drop off from really all the pass rushers this past year in terms of their sack totals. I think a lot of that went hand in hand with just the defense declining overall. But overall, Bryce Huff, if you don't know the name, get to know the name because he's going to be an Eagles favorite.